David and Goliath, and then we'll start moving into kind of the relationship between David and Saul in the beginning, and then kind of what it turned into later on. That's what today will look like. I think we'll finish a couple minutes early, so get you guys a couple minutes to grab coffee and stuff before we start worship. So going into where we stopped, like I said, we talked about David, talked about his courage, talked about him being just a shepherd boy who now goes into this war camp. His brothers almost picking on him more than anything, saying, just, you don't belong. What are you doing here, wicked heart? And then he goes in front of Saul. Saul tries to equip him with a whole bunch of stuff. He can't move in the stuff. He doesn't wear the armor, picks up the stones, and he gets ready. And then now we're on Goliath. I almost want to camp on Goliath for a minute before we go into the actual battle, because there's a lot of interesting stuff. And again, like Mr. Randy was laughing at when we were talking about, I was like, that was something that I only planned on kind of touching the wave top on and moving on. And then I found a thread, and I pulled the thread, and it took me down a really long rabbit hole when you get into Goliath. So first off, Goliath, we know he's really, really big, right? He's a very big man. We know that the Philistines believe in him. He's their warrior. He is the one that they selected. They have, we know this, the technology. They have the army. They've been proven in battle, and yet they say, we want this guy to fight your best guy, and we're good with that. And if we win, we'll be your slaves. So they believe in him, and he's warrior tested. When you go into, I kind of want to read, I'll go to it, 1 Samuel 17:41 through 44, and then we'll talk about it for a second. So, and the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by the gods. The Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. And it's a part that I've read 5-10 times, maybe in my life as a Christian. But coming across some studies, has anybody ever heard of David or Goliath having acromegalia or acromegalia? Has anybody ever heard of that? There's a couple heads. Giant disease. Yeah, the giantism. And what is that? The things that it can cause. Has anybody seen that? I didn't know this until like a year ago, and then I really didn't pull on the thread until like 4 or 5 months ago. Yeah. Yeah. And there were, and we don't read that. We don't know that. It didn't come from the Bible that it said that he had that disease. But I was reading some passages in a book, and he was going, it was called David and Goliath, but he was basically showing that it really wasn't that amazing what David did. That's what he was trying to show. That's what he was showing, that like David had the upper hand. It was like him going in with a .45 caliber versus a guy with a sword. And then he talks about the giant disease. So it's not, he's got some insight, but at the same time, I saw it in multiple places where people believe, and this is people, this is not in the Bible, that he had acromegalia. Acromegalia, it's the giant disease where his pituitary gland developed cysts behind it. His eyesight wouldn't be that great. And the reason why I go to that passage of 17:41 and 44 is because some of the things that he says, where he comes forward, he looked and saw David in disdain, but a youth, ruddy and handsome. The Philistine said to David, my dog that you come to me with sticks. So we know David had one stick. David had one stick with him when he was walking up. He saw multiple sticks. It's just one of the things that you see where the guy was trying to get his point across, that Goliath didn't have that great of eyesight. And then he said, come to me. He wanted to walk to him. There's two parts in that where, one, he's telling David to come to him, and then two, in verse 41, And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. Ground armor troops would have not had a shield bearer in that time. Archers would have had shield bearers. Archers would have had people with them that would have had shield bearers in front of them, and even cavalry would have had shield bearers at some points, and they would hand it to them. Ground troops wouldn't. It's different that he had a shield bearer. Maybe it's because it's prestigious position that he had a shield bearer, but not that likely back in 1000 BC. More than likely, he wasn't moving that great. He had a lot of armor on. He wasn't moving very well. I like that because I was telling Mr. Randy, I really like the fact that, because you look at him and you see like the Philistines, they took this man, oh, we believe in this guy. Like, this is our guy. This is our warrior. He can't see well and he doesn't move well. He can't do the things that he's supposed to do in battle, but he's their guy that they basically put their lives on the line for. Like I said, I like to hold on Goliath for a minute. That was a thread. I saw it. I pulled it. I looked at it a while. It's just an interesting outlook that you don't see when you continuously read this passage. You almost skim over it. It's something to think about. I would encourage you. I'll find the author. There's a few people that talk about him possibly having the giant's disease. It's not in the Bible. We don't know that, but it's just one of those things that you can look at and you can almost use because Philistines believed in this man so much. They put all their values in him, and he could have been blind and slow. Like, now can't see and he can't move that well. Moving on. So this is 1 Samuel 17:41-54. We're not going to read the whole passage. So this is the fight between David and Goliath. This is that moment. I've read it, and I always see when I read this passage. I grew up with the children's Bible, and it's just really quick. It's a really quick page where they just kind of show what happens. That David walks up and he basically like uses his sling, and then he hits him in the head with a rock. I think they left out the part where he cut the head off. They kind of left that part out. It's not something you see too much. So this passage, let me make sure I have the date right. War scholars still use this specific fight. 2004 Fallujah in Iraq. Marines were getting ready to go into Fallujah. It was a really big fight. The Marines had the advantage. The Marines were going to have the advantage in this fight. It was a really big fight that was about to happen. And there's these chaplains. And basically, he's a religious individual who come up. And it's kind of unique for a chaplain to come up before a big fight or before a big push or anything. Chaplain came up. He was doing a talk. He put on the loudspeaker. Let me make sure I get the song right. So he blared heavy metal Christian music on a loudspeaker. And then he had a young Marine stand up and read about how David defeated a giant and then became king and defeated all the Philistines, no matter the technology, no matter the peace. It's still used to this day. This fight is still used to this day. People still use it. And they were using that just to show it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how big you are. It doesn't matter how strong you are. And then believe in your faith. Believe in God. Believe that he'll take care of you. And then you can come out and have victory. I love it. I love that fight. I love that thought, and I love that chaplain did that piece. Like I said, he goes in there and he uses it, and it just kind of reminds everybody what they're doing. Apart with it, two parts to take away. So David, we know, let me go to 17. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone and struck the Philistine and killed him. When the rocks were hit and when they would be slung and used, they were known to actually impale into the body. They would go into the body if it was hit. If a regular ground infantryman or somebody who was walking, and like I said from last week, you have the archers. You have the individuals who are using javelins, who are using archers, who are using slings. They would impale into the body. The Romans, when they had the doctors, they would carry these tongs that could remove stones from their soldiers' bodies while they're either still in battle or while they were done with battle. But they would use it And then that's how they could, they use these little tongs, almost look like little chopsticks, that they would use to remove the stones from the bodies because it could be impaled so deep you couldn't get them out with your fingers. These are wicked devices that he used and he slung and he cracked. Oh, yeah. Hmm. Yeah. 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 Yes, sir.
From a very early age, the shepherd boys, not long after they could walk and then run, started using the sling. So this is not an untested
Yeah.
weapon for David. But you also got to remember, as you get a little physically a little bigger, the sling gets longer as you train it. So he's slinging a sling is probably 3 feet here long, and with a little leather holder for the stone, you let it go at the right time. And it's going in excess of 200 miles an hour is what they estimate.
Yeah.
You don't think you want to get hit in the head with that? Just try it,
Yeah. I'll take it.
Yes, sir.
I can do it. I got it. I can kind of see and hand it. It works.
No, I got it.
It's off now.
You want to be Phil's
But yeah, that was one of the things that I love to see. I love the analogy there where you have a young boy with a sling and you have a giant man covered in armor with a sword and a spear, and you could just see everybody just claiming that okay, the Philistines, we're going to be fine. I can't believe they chose to challenge us. And you can see David and putting yourself in when you get into Israel's army and they're there, you just watched your king Saul, and that'll kind of play into the next piece. He sent a boy to go up there with a sling, and he doesn't even have armor, and he's going up there to fight. You know that for 40 days this man came. Everybody's afraid. Everybody's dismayed. And he's going up there, and if you lose, this isn't something where we're watching on TV, it's a Super Bowl, and we're really rooting for our team. If you lose, bad things are going to happen to you. Horrible things are going to happen to you, and you just watched a boy go up with a sling. You can just imagine the mindset of the army at that time. And kind of thinking, and you can see why David could have been such a great king and his legacy could have been so long, because you forget about that army was there. They watched that. And they're looking up there, and we talked about again last week, if you're in the front and you get chased down and your army breaks, if you're in the front, it wasn't you're this heroic man and you're going to do all these amazing things. You're going to be up there and you're going to defend Israel. If your army loses, the first to break and leave, they're the ones that are going to survive. The ones who stay and fight, they're going to be ran down from behind and speared in the back. And they're going to be the last ones out, and they're going to be the first ones caught. So there's a lot of things that I can just imagine. You know that, like we said, the logistics weren't there. The food's not really there. You don't know how well these guys are eating. For 40 days they've been up there. So it's just there's a lot of things that play off where you can see how David could have been such a successful king, because they're watching this, they're seeing this example, they're seeing this man come forward. A piece that goes into David's character. So in 51, so 1 Samuel 17:51, then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. That's gruesome and fierce. I mean, there's multiple ways that you could have ended a life. Walking up and cutting the head off for a young boy to do, it talks about, it talks about his character. I mean, and I mean it in a good way, but also he's a fierce individual. Like David, the characteristics of him, he was able to walk up, use a spear, and cut the head off of a man. And that's just, there's aggression there, there's fierceness there. It's something you don't think about, but you can see how you have the makings of a great leader. And I know that's very scary and odd to think about. Yes, sir.
The point being, if there was anybody else in his entourage that felt like they were going to step in behind him and take care of business, now with his head off, they know that the Israelites aren't messing around.
No, yeah, exactly. And they just taunted him. They taunted the Israelites for 40 days. And then this boy comes up, shows incredible accuracy, and then just relentless. Yes, sir.
Remember that just previous to this, David's been anointed by Samuel as king, chapter or two back, but maybe a few days, a few weeks, whatever. But God is with David, and you know, I cannot imagine taking on a lion with something like a decent knife.
Yeah.
Maybe it's 12 inches, whatever. It's enough, but I can't imagine. Or a bear. Come on.
Yeah. I was waiting for you to come to the class.
I know you've been
I was
looking
waiting
at
for
me.
you to come to
You've
the
been
class.
looking at me. So those of us that are veterans and you that serve, we're taught to fight battle in a 3D environment, right? Terrain, land, space, air.
This is why I really wanted him in the class.
We can project our armaments. We can for miles, miles above. We can do. There's a number of things we do today. I'm getting to David, but this is battle in its purest form, okay? And what I mean by that is that this is close proximity, all right? So the choice of a larger person somewhat makes sense. Because if I'm going to fight a battle within a few meters away or 2 or 3 feet away, it makes sense that you have a big person there. Yeah. It just does. Yeah. Because if this guy gets his hands on David, David's done. The reality is he's done. But David's smart, and David recognizes that, steps away, prevents that close encounter, and strikes from a far enough distance. That's the keenness of David. That's where he differentiates himself and understands the battlefield, makes a quick assessment, and then chooses a tactic that takes advantage of the space.
Well, this is
Did I do okay?
No, you did great. You did great. You just took the class. No, but we're like building up, and you're seeing the character of David, and you're seeing. That's what's so amazing. Like, this is a young boy, and last week, you weren't here last week, and we talked about, and we'll bring it up again, they didn't have war schools to go to learn these things. They didn't understand, like, distance and tactics. That's not a thing. It just shows God was absolutely with David. And you'll see that as he develops and as he continues on with some of these battles, his tactics and his thoughts. And we'll get into it. But there's many examples of how he's just far above his time. Far above his time. Yes, sir.
Later on, this might be considered some kind of disadvantage for David. God does not allow him to build the temple because of the amount of bloodshed that was associated with David. Mm-hmm. But he gathers up all the materials and has it ready, but anyhow, David was a warrior, but God wouldn't let him do it.
Mm. Yeah.
He said that to the Philistines. he's a military genius.
Yeah.
He's doing it for God's glory.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that's just pushing back to the piece that he knows, and he's just fully trusting in God, and he knows that everything that's being done is God's hand. It's not David. It's God working through David, and like you said. Yeah, absolutely. I can read them. So 45. Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, and that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel." Yeah, and again, like, that's trying to push it back to the fact that it's God working through David, and David just has full trust and seeing his character and seeing that that's going to be a countless thing multiple times in 1st and 2nd Samuel of God, or of David just trusting and believing in God and constantly asking for what he wants him to do, and then also constantly having zero doubts when it comes to what the hand of God is trying to do for him.
He was replying to what Goliath had said to him. Well, I'm doing it by my strength, but David was doing by God's will, and God will be with him, not.
No, exactly, and that's when that thought is perfect when we go to David and Saul, because we'll jump into David and Saul, but I always see Saul as almost a different type of Goliath in a weird way, where it's the people wanted him, and then David was just relying on God, right. And David was using God. Yeah. Going into the aftermath in 1 Samuel 17:52, when we read, let me go to it. "And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout." So this is after David has killed Goliath. "And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Sharam and as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp." This will go into the piece of when you get into the Israelites following David and and the belief that they had in David and the belief that they had in David's belief in God. You have an army, you have foot soldiers, you have these people who didn't know what was going to be next, what was going to come next with, are we going to be chased? Are we going to be taken into slavery? This man's been mocking us for 40 days. And then David comes in, kills the giant, and then the Philistines flee. The technologically advanced Philistines flee, and they're chasing them, and they get their camp, right? They're getting their food. They're getting their gear. They're getting their uniforms. They're getting the clothing. They're getting the equipment. They're using all these things, and it just brings that much more strength into David and David's belief in God, and brings them closer. Because for 40 days they were being taunted and used and just afraid. And you can just understand how maybe their strength in God was starting to winder a little bit. Maybe they were starting to doubt. Maybe. We don't know. But David comes in, and you see that strength come back.
That you're absolutely right. I mean, when David first came, he said, "Why are you letting this uncircumcised Philistine talk about our God that way?" So he was considered naive at the beginning, and then he was considered bold, and that emboldened the other Israelites.
Yeah. Any other comments? All right. No, go ahead. Yeah.
Saul's sword will later come back and be useful to David. I mean, he took it as a spoil of war, but from what the Bible describes, it was size appropriate for Goliath. So imagine this small, ruddy young boy trying to pick up something that, I mean, who knows how much that thing would have weighed.
Yeah.
But pulling it from the scabbard and actually cutting a head off. I mean, you bring up a good point. I mean, that sends a message. And the fact that he took it to Jerusalem wasn't even, Israel did not, that was not their home base yet. David had not become king, had not conquered Jerusalem yet. And so that was David's way of saying, yeah, God did this.
Oh.
There's one other tactic that he uses that I think is worth mentioning, that as he stands there in front of Goliath and gets done with his speech, it says that he turned and ran directly at the giant. I mean, just sprinted towards him. And for me, I'd be going, rock, tree to hide behind. Look, over there, flanking maneuver, right? He runs right straight at him. And I think you think of this big guy who's slow and kind of nearsighted, kind of just long enough to surprise him to go, huh?
Yeah.
And as he does that, the rock goes right in and it's over. And I just think it's such a great thought that he just had no idea about retreat. He just went straight at him. And I think that was enough to throw him off, to just go, to give that millisecond for him to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
I've always loved that.
Oh, no, yeah. That's just straightforward.
And wish that I could do that, but
Yeah.
I'd be looking for a rock.
Yeah. No, really good. So the aftermath. Talked about the aftermath. Talked about the Philistines fleeing. Now getting into and transitioning into David and Saul. And I really like the thought of you're just going to... I was telling Mr. Randy this too. We were sitting in the back for a little bit. I was telling Mr. Randy this too. In a weird way, like I relate. I feel like I relate to Saul. And I know that sounds bad, but I just feel like Saul is the world. There's worldly thoughts, worldly matters, and David is just godly acts, godly thoughts, not unwavering, straightforward. He is not going to the side to side. I mean, he makes mistakes, and we see that later on. But and you just constantly see this in the study of when you get into Saul and David. I like it, but at the same time, I just constantly look at Saul, and you think about, here's a man who earlier in 1 Samuel, I mean, you can just almost tell how the plot's going to go. When they're asking Samuel for a king, and Samuel's like, whoa, wait a minute. And then God's like, no, give him a king. Give him a king. He's going to take their things. He's going to demand things of them. Give him a king. You can see the setup is not going great for the startup of Saul. And then you talk about, after this happened, where is Saul as a king? Where is he? He's the biggest. It says he's a head taller than the rest of them. People, his soldiers, were more than likely, and this is not in the Bible, more than likely assuming that he's going to go fight. I mean, you would think that would be the mindset, is that, oh, there's their giant. Here's our great king who's bigger than the rest of us, who has the great armor. This is going to be the battle, and he doesn't go. He sends a boy to go. You could just see how he can start to become very nervous, how he could start to see that David as a threat, and knowing that David is a threat, is somebody that's a very big threat to him. It's just something that you start to play out, and you see it. So 1 Samuel 18, 6 and 7. The top of mine says Saul's jealousy of David. As they were coming home, when David returned from striking down the Philistine, the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with songs of joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated. Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. That's going to go a long way. That's a problem if you're king. There's a lot of people like laughing, and you can just see.
And it isn't that Saul was a giant. He was maybe 6'2", 6'3".
Yeah.
But everybody else was really short.
Yeah.
Including David.
Yeah.
David was probably 5'8".
Yeah, and that's just, well, there's their biggest. He's really big, but here's ours, and he's our king. And you just think you would see that. Then the songs start playing. You can see how this is going to start to play out. 1 Samuel 18 in verse 21, you already start to see. So David, let me go to it. Saul thought, he's talking about his daughter, let me give her to him, that she may be a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Therefore Saul said to David a second time, you shall now be my son-in-law. So he's trying to use his daughter to tempt David. David, go fight the Philistines. He's hoping the Philistines will beat him. Saul's jealousy starting to build up, and David is just successful time after time after time. The reason why I bring this piece in, well, it'll hit the next point, but before that, Saul could have used David. He could have used him. You have this man who is like after God's own, like he is unwavering religion, unwavering service, believes in God, a matter from my own heart per God. Like there's all of these things that David has that Saul could have used, but instead Saul sees it as a threat. And you turn that into today, same things. There's so many things that we can use, so many things that we can take, and it could be a good thing, but we see it as a threat. To me, like I said, Saul constantly reminds me of the world, the worldly thoughts, the worldly character. Through time, going into, so you go down a little bit, like I said, David should be a 12-week study. If you're going into David, when I knew I had 4 weeks, really focusing on the military stuff of David, fast forward a little bit, David flees. We know that David has passion behind Saul's son, that Saul's son Jonathan is devoted to David, and he's helping David, and there's people who care about David. So we'll get into 1 Samuel. So 1 Samuel 23, 7 and 8. This starts talking about Saul. Now it was told Saul that David had come to Keilah, and Saul said, God has given him into my hand, for he has shut himself in by entering a town that has gates and bars. So Saul's mindset, because you read this a couple times, and we'll skip up in a minute to David's mindset and Saul's mindset. Saul just declared, he has made the decision. Did he go to God and did he pray about it? Did he ask God? Saul declared that God has given him unto my hand, into my hand, for he has shut himself in by entering a town that has gates and bars. So Saul's mindset is immediately like, God has given him to me. He's mine. You move up in the passage and you just go into verses 2 and verses 4 where David is trying to make decisions. He's trying to decide what's best. And constantly you see, therefore David inquired of the Lord, shall I go and attack these Philistines? And the Lord said to David, go and attack the Philistines and save Keilah. But David's men said to him, behold, we are afraid here in Judah. How much more then if we go to Keilah against the armies of the Philistines? Then David inquired of the Lord again, and the Lord answered him again. So Saul's mindset, the Lord has delivered him to me. He's given him to me. He's put him in an impossible spot where I can attack. David's mindset is constantly to turn back to the Lord. Constantly ask the Lord for what to do. Believing in the Lord. The unwavering, like I love the straightforward, the unwavering thought, the unwavering, no matter where I'm at, no matter how bad it gets, let me ask the Lord what to do, and he will answer. That's again, you just see David's strength. It's another characteristic of him that you're starting to see.
It just occurred to me when you said Saul, that reminded me of Saul of Tarsus. He was the same way. Until he listened to Christ, he assumed that he was doing God's will. And it wasn't until he actually listened that he discovered that he was going absolutely the wrong direction.
Yeah. Yeah. This is one of the ones, and we'll wrap up here. So again, breaking down David's characteristics. We know he's fierce. We know he's passionate. We know he's completely devoted to God. His decisions that he makes, he constantly goes back to God. He constantly, it doesn't matter if a whole army doesn't believe, he believes. And he's not afraid to scold that army. The last one you see with David and Saul, David sparing Saul. 1 Samuel 24, 1-7. David's in the cave, right? David's in the cave. He has an opportunity. His men are telling him he has the opportunity to kill Saul. And David going right back. He's not listening to men. He's not listening to what they're saying. He goes right back to saying, this is God's king. Let me read it. Yep. I was just going to try to get. There we go. Yep. I was trying to find the verse for you guys. I don't know why. Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of Israel and went to seek David and his men in front of the wild goats' rocks. And he came to the sheepfolds by the way where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts of the cave, and the men of David said to him, here is the day which the Lord said to you, behold, I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it shall seem good to you. Then David arose and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's robe, and afterward David's heart struck him because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. He said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put out my hand against him, seeing he is the Lord's anointed. He has an opportunity. This man is chasing him. He left his home. He's living in a cave. His men are even telling him, God delivered him to you. He's yours. He's yours for the taking. This man's trying to kill you. And unwavering, devoted, goes in there and he's struck. And he says, this is the Lord's anointed. I can't touch him. He's teaching them a lesson. And you still got to understand, this is a fierce man that has no problem whatsoever cutting the head off of a giant. He has no problem going out and fighting with a giant. He's won multiple battles already. He's showing the peace that the humbleness, the part where he shows a trait that you're not going to see in a lot of successful military leaders or kings, the humbleness piece. You could spend a long time talking about how many battles were lost because of humbleness and because of too much pride and the leaders believing that they're the one true one. They're the one. It's our fight. We're the good guys. And David constantly in this moment steps back. He's not thinking about himself. He's not thinking, well, this man's trying to kill me. He's cornered me into a cave. I'm in the innermost of the cave. Instead, he stops, teaches a lesson. Like I said, going into the character just shows another character piece when it goes to David. Any last-minute comments?
What I think of is going back to what you said when if Saul would have used David. This last thing where he spares his life shows that David is fiercely loyal. He still considered Saul the king, and he would have done anything and everything within his power to keep Saul king. All of David's victories, all of David's accomplishments still could have been underneath King Saul if Saul just would have recognized that. But what David took away from Saul was the glory. And Saul couldn't live with that. Saul could have had everything that he had and everything that David had if he was willing to give up the glory, if he was willing to give credit to David for being this great man. But he wasn't willing to do that, and that caused his downfall.
And spoiler alert, Saul doesn't survive all of this. But even when Saul is killed, he isn't killed in battle. He asks to be killed so that he won't be captured. And David, when he hears of this, the man who comes and expects to have a reward, who killed Saul, is instead killed himself for killing God's anointed.
Yeah.
So David is true to the end.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. All right, let's wrap up. We'll go ahead and close up. I'll lead us in a prayer, and then we'll break before worship. Please pray with me. Lord, we thank you for providing us this opportunity to come together, to meet in this here, and to study your word. Lord, we ask that as we study your word, that we become closer with you, that we have the ability to take the knowledge and go forward and help bring people towards you. Lord, as always, we ask that everything that was said and done here today is done in a manner that's pleasing unto you and according to your will. We pray all these things in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen.